Alrighty folks, welcome back to our second site for the tour. So we're here now on the top of another very unique part of Centennial Park, and this place here represents quite firmly the geological deep time history of the area. So the Centennial Park, or the parklands in this space, they sit atop a geological unit called the Botany Sands, and as the name suggests, when we can look around here you can see this stuff here. The soil here is completely, almost totally sand, or at least on the top layer here. It's intersected with a range of other different geological units, the Waverley Coffee Stone as well, but mostly it's part of this Botany Sands. And that's Botany Sands sits atop the layer of the, and that's aeolian sand, so that's coming in from windblown areas. And that came across on top of the Quaternary Hawkesbury sandstone layer that sits underneath Sydney. And so this sand area here really reflects this kind of how this area is also, yes, this is freshwater country, this is saltwater country, this is swampland country, but this is also sand dune country as well. So most of the areas around eastern Sydney, so the kind of the hills that we can see around Coogee and Bondi, these are all, if we dig a little bit deeper, ancient sand dunes that formed around this area. Soil is kind of accumulated over the top of those sand dunes, but if you look back in the historical images, only about 100 years ago, places around Bondi and Coogee, you can still see those sand dunes. You come to a point here in Centennial Park where the sand dune is exposed at the top, and you can see how firmly present the sand is here. And this sand actually also acts as an interesting permeable layer to connect between the surface topography on the top here and the underlying surface geology underneath, and namely the Botany Sands Aquifer, which sits under most of this region. So it's kind of the southeastern chunk of the Sydney Peninsula. The Centennial Park really is at the northernmost limits of this aquifer, and it heads down towards Botany Bay. So this aquifer that sits underneath this Botany Sands stratum absorbs a lot of the surface water rain that we get. So the rain that we're seeing around this area, intentionally in these swampy areas, would seep down in through this geological layer and would amass into this groundwater aquifer that sits underneath Sydney. And points around the park and around eastern Sydney where this aquifer meets the surface, we get areas where we have natural springs. So I'll be taking you to one a little bit later on in the tour, Lachlan Springs, or Lachlan Swamps as it's now known. And that's kind of one of the only natural spring waters around this part of Sydney now. But in another time there used to be a number of these different springs or kind of intersections where the surface water and the subsurface waters would meet. So from this point here we can also see, if we look behind me, we can see a lot of restoration or ecological rehabilitation that's happening here. This is also because this sandy country here, this sandy environment, helps to foster what's known as the Eastern Suburbs Banksia scrubland, an endangered ecological community around this area. So whilst there's not ESBS in this particular part here, the ecosystems that we can see thriving around us here need to be cared for, and that's cared for by threats such as invasive species, but also things like dogs and other animals coming in and kind of threatening local wildlife as well. So we can see this is kind of a unique little part of the park here. It might be a little bit tricky for you to get to if you're coming on foot, but if you have a look, it's probably maybe 100 metres off the main Grand Drive around here, between the Grand Drive and Allison Road, and just on the right over there for you. So from this point here, we can start to appreciate the topography and the geology of this site, and that actually has a really, really big influence on the next point of this trip, which we're talking about the presence of water. So I've already talked about the aquifer and those springs, and that has a really, really key part in post-invasion history of this site as well. So we'll head over to our next site and we'll talk a little bit more about water.